Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Stephen Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, are landlords criminals, and is the state a landlord? Tim.
Hating on landlords is a very common position amongst the left generally, social democrats and so forth. And I got this title from watching a Vice program on high rents. The Vice has run a few things on this, and the particular thing was on mobile home parks. People were buying the land underneath them and then raising the rents on the mobile homes that were on top of them. And they're not really movable mobile homes. So, you could call this, in a sense, a criminal act. But if you look and dig into the quote-unquote entrepreneur that was doing it, it's just taking advantage of a government loan program. The whole reason his position exists is because of the government. The whole reason that an entrepreneur can swoop in and, quote-unquote, I use air quotes in there, he's just taking advantage of his market position. And more broadly, you landlords, you listen to Keith Preston, you listen to Noam Chomsky, you listen to Jimmy Dore. This sort of left anarchist social democrat street where landlords are just viewed as at best middlemen, at worst just outright exploiting criminals here. I was also recently, maybe a year ago, Peter Santello was covering some of the when the rent moratorium in places like New York. Certain landlords couldn't collect rent, but they still had to pay property taxes, which brings me to the elephant in the room that a lot of rentators seem to miss, or whether it's strategic or they just say, well, that's not our main focus. Is a good question. But there is a kind of rent that, at least in the United States, you have to pay, which is property taxes. I'm not sure what the precise situation is in other countries or Britain, but in the United States, you have to pay property taxes. And it can be anywhere from $200, $300 a month, about $3,000 a year if you own like a $200,000 house, which, depending on where you are, is about, depending on what you want, is about an average house or close to an average house. So there's a tax that everyone tends to forget. And oftentimes, and even strong towns, which we'll get to, which I have a few articles we'll talk about here, strong towns even would criticize the property tax because you just base it on value on your house. So your house is worth $200,000. You get to pay whatever 2% on that, which is like a few $1,000s. Forgive my bad quick mental math here. So that's one issue. That's one issue. A lot of like the progressive types misses here. They complain about landlords, but then if you look into what landlords actually do with their money, a good portion of it just goes to paying taxes on the building there. It's not them just going to vacations in the Cayman Islands or vacations in the Caribbean. It's them, just paying the services here in the state. And also, interesting things about landlords. Sometimes landlords will, and this was in a Strong Towns message forum on the comments section. The Strong Towns one person didn't want to improve their apartments for their tenants because they didn't want to raise the rents. They didn't want, because it would raise the property values. If you raise the property values, they'd have to raise the rent. So it would break up their entire scheme. And the Strong Towns founder, when he did it, was like, at first didn't understand exactly why they were didn't want any of these sort of sidewalk improvements. Well, actually, the city was going to do it, the sidewalks improvements and so forth, but he didn't want any of that because it would just raise the property values, which raise the taxes on them. So that's something that a lot of progressives, rent haters tend to forget here. And this goes back to one of my favorite Hoppe lectures, Who Exploits Whom? In that instance, you could argue that the landlords are just as much exploited as their rentees. And especially if there's rent moratoriums in New York City, but property taxes are still owed. And that's actually another thing that was cited was cited by one of the critics, so to speak, of Vice. Interviewed a couple of people, and one of the critics of them was saying, well, they have to sort of make back their losses, so they're going to raise the rents 30%, which each increase the money supply 40%. Why wouldn't rents go up 30%? Surprise, surprise. And also zoning, another thing that the Strong Towns website criticizes, which is sort of a new urbanist thing. Zoning, you can only have single family, or you can only have commercial. You have to have certain parking requirements. If you go back, at least in the United States, these were all started by the state. It wasn't private corporations. It was the state creating this. It was actually FDR New Deal. A lot of the stuff comes from, or the Eisenhower highway administration. So the thing, first of all, let's start with the question: are landlords criminals? And then we'll move on. And I would think So if that's true, I think the state is definitely a landlord because it collects taxes, and in the same way that a rent is collected. And what does it actually do with that money? Well, landlords give it to the state, oftentimes in taxes. Now they do benefit somewhat from it. But Swithin, what do you make of our opening argument here, and uh, the general lacking of? You see, all the people hate rent, but they seem to miss taxes and those things. Swithin?
Oh, that's certainly true. That people forget the tax level. I mean, in England, the taxes on property is less of a problem because it's actually paid. Well, there's something called council tax, which is essentially a property tax, except the value of your properties are only assessed like every 10 years or some long time period. And also it's the responsibility of the occupier rather than the owner to pay. Because the idea is that they're providing local service to people living there. So if you're not living there, well, then you don't pay it. If it's left empty or completely empty, I don't think you do. So that is less of an issue in England than it is in the US. But directly to the question, are landlords criminals? Well, insofar as they legitimately own the land, and let's assume that it is possible to homestead land, and let's assume that's true, because obviously if you're going to take the occupation and use position, then they are all criminals. That's essentially the position of existential comics, who basically said that interest and rent were illegitimate. It's the only thing that was justifiable is wages. So you could take that view. But insofar as assuming you can sort of, as it were, privatize the land properly as an absentee owner, are they criminals? Well, only to the extent that they don't legitimately own the land. And there are historical cases that you could say, enclosures acts in particular in England, where sort of common land, which really wasn't common, but was where various families had ancestral developed rights to use the land for various uses and various like grazing or whatever. And these people weren't really compensated or sort of bought out of their use rights in any way. So there are sort of historical things, but I mean, in a sense, that's just sort of going down the reparations line, which we've discussed before. When it comes to the state is clearly a landlord, as you point out. I mean, the land is sort of like a landlord per excellence. I mean, it claims it has unparalleled sovereign jurisdiction over a particular area. I mean, that sounds like pretty much like a landlord. And clearly the state is a criminal. If you haven't been hiding under a rock for the past 3 years, you will have realised that the state is a criminal, and a pretty obvious one at that. To the question, though, as to why, I mean, really the thing is, when it comes to landlords, is landlords can somehow increase their rents. And people don't like them increasing their rents because they think, well, it hasn't really got any better in any meaningful way, or would just be maintained. Why have they been able to put the prices up so much? That's really the nub of the question is, how is it the case that landlords can increase their prices in the way in which they do? Now, this seems to me now, from an obvious standpoint, let's talk about the supply side first. I mean, the question is, is the house building of various types restricted beyond what it might otherwise be? And as you said, with zoning laws, that's certainly true. In the case of Britain, since 1946, which was one of many, I can't remember which one, of the Town and Country Planning Act, that set into law for the first time that ownership did not imply the right to development. Prior to 1946, if you owned something, you were presumed to have the right to develop it, unless someone objected. And you get gradual incursions into what you can do with your land. I think from the late 19th century, various town and country planning acts in the early 20th century in England and Wales, it would be. But from 1946, so if I want to build a house on a piece of land which hasn't been registered for permitted to build there before, I would have to go and get planning permission from the state and the local council to do that. So in America, that'd be like the city council in larger areas. Now, just to give you an idea of timescale for this, for major housing developments, it takes an average. This is in Scotland. This was something the Scottish Libertarian Party noted. It took over a year to just get planning permission. And you got to remember is they have prepared their proposal. And it's probably taken them a year to prepare the proposal to begin with, and then they have a year negotiation. And this is to build houses that are basically the same as all the other houses that exist, because to a large extent you can only build houses the state wants you to build because they have very, very specific requirements on what you can build. A lot of the housing now has to be quote unquote high density, because if you look at new build houses in England, for instance, they're on average, unless they're particularly expensive, their floor plans are smaller than older houses because the state wants high density housing. So there's huge restrictions when it comes to even building, and that's even leaving aside different variety. I mean, there's an interesting podcast called I listen to occasionally, An Architecture, and they had on I can't remember his first name. It's someone called Schumacher. He worked with Zaza Hadid. And he said basically, like, you can't just build a new interesting building because you basically can only build what the state allows you to build because of the precision and stringency, of the zoning, of the planning and building codes. And then, of course, you have things like the restrictions on who can be an electrician these days. I mean, back in the day, you could do your own electrics. I'm talking about only 20 years ago, but now you have to get an efficient electrician. A guy I know, he can do the electrics, but he's not a qualified electrician. So he sets it all up just so the guy with the certificate come on and connects it up. Clearly, that's going to make things a lot more expensive to build. And so on supply, so you've got not only have you got permission to build, you've got the what you can actually build and whether that's what people want. Tim, any questions on the sort of supply side issues before I hit some more demand side issues?
No questions. I'll just add another comment. Taking in California, which is one of the states that are extremely expensive, and a lot of the sort of progressive commentators are complaining about high rents. One of the things that now there's always like a lot of, I mean, in this sense, Rothbard's right. You want the government to have long regulations because at least you can find loopholes. But in general, I think most new housing in California requires solar panels. To get solar panels is fairly expensive. So there's a sort of tricky way in which, if you just want to build housing quick, you're not going to building a bunch of solar panels. Well, this is a roundabout way to do it. And there's also various other things you have to do, and like coding. Now, some of the coding stuff might be considered reasonable. Although, this goes back to sort of what exactly is reasonable. It goes back to my EdFez, right? A lot of these sort of things you can drive a truck through here. Even with the zoning, for example, you're talking about supply side. One of the ways to increase the supply is to get rid of single family zoning or lower zoning in town and country. It makes the state the de facto landlord. So people complain to the landlords that are charging higher rents, but their supply is restricted to begin with for various reasons, as you mentioned here. And on top of that, like if you want to go out and build new things, you can't do it for like environmentalist reasons here. So those types could just easily blame for the quote unquote housing crisis, if of course exists, as well as YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, NIMBY. This is another restriction factor here, which restricts arguably the supply. A lot of social democrats will hem and haw over this because, in reality, a lot of their proposals are technically NIMBY. So a lot of the environmental stuff, you can't build this house because you might, there might be a stream, or there might be a tree, or there might be some eagle's nest. There's a lot of, even Elon Musk's, for example, not that I'm necessarily a fanboy of him, But they've been delaying this whole rocket launch program in southern Texas because there's like fisheries that are protected around it. And it's like at the end of the day, somewhere you're going to have to, if you want more housing, you might have to destroy a few fishes here or there. So in this sense, the state is the de facto landlord. And a lot of things that the progressive commentators complain about are things that they more or less de facto support. And again, like roofs, one of the reasons roofs are more expensive is, at least in the United States, it's a lot of oil products go into roofs. Why is oil more expensive? Well, let me scratch my head. I can think of two reasons. One is the war, and the other is, of course, what war sanctions we don't need to do. And the other, of course, is restricting the oil supply. So, like, if you look at like lots of petroleum products are in housing, from my understanding. So those would be my additional comments. I think there's a lot of things that restrict the supply, and lots of things that progressives, social democrats, and even left anarchists, so-called left anarchists, either outright champion for or don't, particularly deny. So I think.
Oh yes, and certainly on the environmental angle, the cost of building new properties now, you have to have massive amounts of insulation, which ironically probably contribute to the fact that people found it unbearably hot in England because somehow it reached 90 at some points in the recent past. Because once the building gets warm, it's quite difficult to make it cool because of the insulation or the environmental requirements. So yeah, I mean the NIMBYism. I mean that's one of the most annoying things as well. A lot of people complain about, oh no, housing development's bad because it's building on the green belt. It's building on forests, or not necessarily forests, but on farming land and stuff. Well, that's because it tends to be easier to get planning permission on there, on the basis that you have less complainants. If you build on brownfield sites, which have already been developed, there's loads of people around there who can complain, and therefore delay the process even more. Just another thing on planning. I mean, I wanted to get an extension to my house, and they said that no, I couldn't do it because it would harm the character of the area. The area is a bunch of 1950s council houses, to which most people probably don't care what they look like. Yet somehow I couldn't do it. Now, you might think, well, this is an extension. Why does that make much difference? Well, because if I was particularly concerned about the space, well, what this would then mean is I'd have to demand the house that was bigger somewhere else. Whereas if I could have just extended it, then I wouldn't have needed to do so. This is also what I always thought about with housing is people think it's too expensive to buy the houses they want to fit all their family in, although birth rates aren't as high as they used to be. If you could more easily develop your own and have like a relatively small property, but then easily, increase the space there by, adding extensions, front, back, side, whatever, then there'd be less need to move, and so there'd be less demand for the smaller lot of larger houses, or smaller houses, depending on which ones you need to go to. So supply is a huge issue. They always claim, oh, we're trying to get around this, but the state never does anything. It always says, oh, no, we're going to build 10,000 more houses. It's like, let people build houses they want. Don't just tell them that, oh, we're going to build them here. So that's definitely a supply issue. Right, demand. One aspect that tends to be pointed out for demand for housing, for increasing prices of houses and also rental, is immigration. The UK has net immigration of about 300,000 a year, and the population of about 65 million. So that's a pretty large proportion. That said, according to a housing consultant I spoke to, he doesn't think that immigration, at least in the short term, makes that much difference, at least in England, because most of the people who come are single and moving to cities where there's sort of very small flats that are easy to access, and so he doesn't think they make that much difference to the demand and for larger properties in particular. Now, he didn't say this, but I suspect it would make a difference in the long term. But given what he says in the short term, that seems somewhat reasonable. Although, as well, in the case of the UK, looking at immigration, you'll be careful. as to which of those are students, because a lot of those people coming in and leaving could well be students, although not all of them. As you may have been known if you've watched any British TV recently, a lot of people coming on dinghies to the UK are actually Albanian men. Well, not all. It's not all sort of immigration. Although I do think immigration would make a difference in the long term when it comes to birth rates, because depending where they come from, if the Indian subcontinent, in the case of the UK, they have higher birth rates, and so that's going to have clearly going to mean increased demand for larger properties and also more properties in the long term. Now, what I would say though is, what at least the housing guy I spoke to, what seems to be the biggest demander though of more property in England is household dissolution. I had a look at some figures. These ones were from about 2003-4, and a journalist and that guy I know said more recently it was the figure I'm going to say. So like in 2003-4, I think it was only about 47% of 15-year-olds lived with their biological father, and that, according to a journalist guy I know, so that was over 50%, so it's probably even higher now. So clearly, if you had a family, let's say of 2 parents and 3 children, they live in one property, but if they get divorced and they split up, and well, that means 2 properties, and the average space required for each of the persons there when you have separate dwellings is going to be higher than if you can put them all in one, because you don't, in a sense, get the economies of scale that you would otherwise get. So that does seem to be one of the major causes of the increase in demand in the medium term, really. Tim, any comments on immigration and sort of increased population and household dissolution?
With respect to immigration, like in places like California, which is where a lot of the progressive, and Texas, well, lesser extent in Texas, but in particular California, I really find it hard to believe that it's not a factor. Like it might not be the factor, but in 1990, California's population was just under 30 million, 29 million and change. Now it's almost 40 million, 39 and change, and that's the counted population. There's probably a huge amount of uncounted population in it too. So I find it hard to believe. And actually, the Vice thing that was actually covering one of the trailer parks, well, that might have been a different Vice episode, was dealing with mainly Mexican Americans of some variety, which is fine. But it's like, yeah, this is sort of like, well, of course this is going to happen. I mean, this is one of the arguments against it. You're adding and if you look back in 50 years, if you expand the population back in like 50 years, basically in the 70s, California's population has doubled. Has the amount of housing gone up? Probably not. So maybe that's an argument against, mass immigration here. If you don't create housing crises, it'll create, and then the effects on the prices are obvious. Well, if 5 people want one apartment, then the price, the only thing that the rational thing for the landlord to do is to raise the price, and that then to create a better, so the person who wants to pay the most money will get the piece of house. And if you combine that with the the single family zoning rules, you can't add additions on things like that, then the thing gets even worse. So the fact that immigration has no effect, I find that dodgy here. Maybe in the short run it doesn't, but again, it's actually a good thing for the existing property owners here. And that's actually one thing that the strong town people actually, I'd say, arguers are smarter than the general progressive critics of this. And why? Partly because the founder, and again, he's probably a weak free marketeer, but he did write a article for the conservative case against, he wrote it for the American Conservative, the conservative case against suburbs here. So yeah, I do think it has an effect. I do think the explosion of population, I don't see, sort of from a praxeological point, to use like a Walter Block term, I don't think how it could not have an effect on the price of a good given unit. And as far as another way to control it, the Vice thing at least admits that rent control just creates long lines for cheap units. So you just have lotteries. You have 20. So we'll just freeze the price. But here's the thing. We'll just have rent control, and then we'll have a lottery, and we'll just have someone will win the lottery, so to speak. And that's in fact what they're doing. They're just buying an apartment for 10% of market value, or 40 or some like very low price. And I mean, it's a wealth transfer in a sense, subsidy of some kind. But does that really solve it? No. Then it actually turns those property owners, they're actually beneficiaries of the system. The people they get in, they don't want to leave. Life's good for them. They got a good deal. They got a perfect apartment in New York City, and it's on a rent control price. So at least Vice, the economist they record on high rents, admits that, well, this doesn't really do anything for the other 9 out of 10 people that lose the lottery for the home. So rent control, I mean, this is a common talking point for Walter Block and Walter Block's teacher, Gary Becker here, what tests what here. But, those two things, which I would say that definitely affect not only the supply and the demand. And if you have to rent control it, why would you build there? So what do you make of my comments about with respect to rent control and with respect to immigration? Swithin?
Rent control is clearly stupid, and is just going to restrict supply. And as the economist in there said, I mean, the real, well, I don't think it's just a big issue, but one of the major issues is supply. And that is a very bad idea. And I mean, I think in California in particular is just a terrible place to do business. I mean, you just require forever to get licensed and get permission to build. I remember someone saying it was much easier to run a business in China than it was in California, which is probably true. With respect to immigration, I do think immigration makes some difference. I just think you need to nuance the case that, oh no, it's just immigration. Now in California it might be. I mean, it's going to depend on the type of immigrants. It's going to depend on what type of housing you have currently and how much you have of it. If it's the case, which this guy claimed in the UK, that there's a lot of sort of like single flats and things above shops and things, and if you are living and working in the city and you're single and you're male typically, then you can fill those relatively easily. There's quite a lot of them. It might become more difficult when there's more people. But certainly over time, immigration will make a difference. The question is when, I would say. And then obviously so population increase might make some difference. But in the case of the UK, demographics are going down. So that's probably not going to make huge amount of difference, except in specific areas. The US has not great demographics either, below replacement rate. Although this is where Peter Zion says, oh no, immigration is good because it's keeping the demographics up. Unlike, say, China, who are a rapidly aging population. And interestingly as well, their housing market has collapsed in recent months. Because, well, it was all built on, guess what? Cheap loans. Which brings me to the issue that a lot of people neglect, seemingly when it comes to housing, is, well, what's really going up in price? Now, this is more relevant for buying rather than renting as such. But buying, but the bigger factor is not the house price, but the land price. I had a look around. The normal for new build houses, they have the 3-to-1 rule of thumb. So essentially, the idea is that if you buy a new property, a third of the value of the lot is the land, and 2/3 is the price of the house. But then after about 10 years, it then goes to about a 50-50 ratio, because you don't have the new house premium anymore. It's a bit tired. Maybe you would expect it not to be in as good a shape, in the same way like a second-hand car isn't as good a shape as a new one. And so thereafter you get like this 50-50 split in sort of, well, half is the value of the house and half is the value of the land. Now, then someone else said on this thread that, well, no, it just depends on its individual circumstance. And I do think that's probably true to a large extent, because, I mean, if you haven't actually improved your house in any meaningful way and the value of the house goes up, well, it's pretty much the land price going up. So then the question is, well, why the land price is going up so much? Well, what does seem to be the case is when there is cheap credit available, the money and an increase in the money supply, this money ends up in property and in land, and the value of the land goes up. There's an interesting parallel to the Austrian business cycle theory by a guy called Fred Harrison, who was interestingly a Georgist. He predicted a crash in 2010 because I read his book in like 2005. And to be fair, predicting going all out so there would be a crash in 2010 and it was in 2008 isn't bad going time-wise. And he argued that there was an 18 years cycle in land value, which actually links very nicely with the Austrian business cycle theory and monetary expansion, low interest rates causing increases in prices of capital goods that artificially go higher than they otherwise would because of cheap credit. And this is the major reason why the housing costs have gone up. I mean, and think about recently, why have the house prices gone up so much now? I mean, I think the average house cost in the UK today is £315,000. Sorry, no, £290,000. And to put this into perspective, if you look at the ratio between average income and house price, today is the highest it's ever been. It's even higher than it was prior to the crash in 2009, at nearly 9 times average income. And the US is the same. The US has now gone over 8. So actually housing in the UK is more expensive, which isn't surprising considering there's less land per person. So the US ones are lower. So this is one of the major factors. And I mean, the amount of monetary creation that took place in 2020, I mean, this is clearly going to be available. And you can bid up land prices. As an aside with this, what was it? Some rich guy, really rich guy in England said, how do you get rich or something in England? And he said something to the effect of, well, just find somebody who was a descendant of a friend of William the Conqueror. Well, one of the main things, he gave lots of land to people. And land does seem to be the major sort of issue as to why the value goes up. Because, I mean, why would you expect a house that's in the same area when it gets older and more tired and needing refurbishment to go up in price? Well, of course you wouldn't. Like a car. I mean, the car gets older, it gets cheaper. It can go up in price, but that doesn't seem to happen with houses. Well, why? Because it's the land. And then the question is, well, is it just monetary inflation? Well, I don't think it's just that. But that's certainly a major factor. So, Tim, what do you think about sort of cheap credit and land value increases relative to other factors which may or may not increase the land values in particular areas?
Oh, yeah, I entirely agree. The houses are just an asset which people use to, well, in the United States, at least, people use this as a sort of retirement or it's inheritance in a sense. So, like, the main asset that most people have left when they die is their house, and they'll just divide it amongst their heirs. They'll sell it, for a fairly good price, and they'll divide that amongst. So, in that sense, the money just turning housing. Like, this is a good reason to be an anarchist, not a social democrat, if you want equality here. If you want to sort of attack inheritance, don't attack inheritance head on. Don't attack the symptoms of it. Attack the main asset which allows it to happen, which is housing. So people will just own a lot of wealth through land, houses, and they'll just sell them and they'll give that it's a great way to hedge against inflation. Now, again, the question to me is always whom is benefiting here to a certain extent here. And, with respect to, I think it's understandable, although the third worlds wouldn't be understandable. I think it's understandable for middle class households in the United States to use their houses as assets. The trouble is, and Strong Towns admits this, the trouble is this just bids up the price for their children to buy houses later on. So it's a kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul situation here, with respect to houses instead of borrowing the future. So if I have one criticism to strong towns things, they'll say that the suburban growth expansion boom is a Ponzi scheme. And there's other YouTube channels that Strong Towns is not a YouTube channel, but they also have the Not Just Bikes and City Beautiful. That's sort of like progressive city type planners. They'll say that the suburbs are a Ponzi scheme. Well, you could just argue that the whole America is just the whole Western world in a sense is some sort of giant Ponzi scheme done by the Fed and the Marshall Plan and things like that. And this is where you get into Peter Schiff territory here, because you said, well, he had a year prediction about when the housing crisis would happen. You sort of get into Peter Schiff territory, where if you take some sort of peer view, well, this thing has to blow up. And this sort of reminds me of our Austrian is Mises and Moldbug right about banking episode here with respect to the using of housing as a sort of the main asset in our society, which is rather strange considering that land in a sense is super abundant here in some ways. Land, because less farming land is used now than was used in years past. So that would be my point. One of the reasons I think it's quite clear that one of the reasons why rent is expensive. There's no real reason why rent should be anything. I mean, but see, this goes back to property taxes here. You can't, in order to buy land, you need a loan to get them, because you can't, the state owns it and the state wants to property tax it. And on the strong towns thing, a commenter was making fun of the fact that like a city like St. Louis, there's lots of homes that are foreclosed, but they're like the home's worth basically -$, because it has like $100,000 of back taxes on it. In order to buy the home, you have to buy the taxes here. So this is again where progressives in the managerial class, they sort of benefit by having pensions and things like that for the schools, which don't necessarily drive results. So some of the Georgists will say it's user fees. Well, do the user fees benefit the people who actually do it, and do we have any reason for them to think it would benefit here? So in my view, land taxes are arguably dodgy things, and actually state mandated credit for them is dodgy, because then it just gives certain people the privilege to buy. It just drives up the price. That'd be my analysis here. Do you have anything to disagree here, Swithin? Any further comments here with respect to the state as a landlord?
Yeah. I mean, any sort of state loan or backed loan to anything in particular is just going to be an indirect subsidy to whoever produces it, because the demand is going to go up more than it otherwise would do, and then that's just going to be pocketed by the other people. I mean, like in the UK, for instance, the existence of student loans, which are different in America, they're much cheaper for you to use here, and after I think 25 years they're written off anyway. That's just an indirect subsidy to the university system, obviously. And then, if it's for buying houses, clearly the price of houses is going to go up. This is why you should always oppose vouchers of any sort, because all it will do is increase prices. If you just gave people more money, well, yes, you might expect prices to go up, but the thing is, it won't be evenly distributed. It'll be down to whoever the individual in question, down to the individual where he'd spend his money, and he might spend it in one place, he might spend it somewhere else. But you're not going to get that uniform increase, in prices in that way. So vouchers and government mandated schemes, it's either a stupid suggestion or just entirely cynical, because they know that they'll be on the receiving end of the benefits of the system.
So do you have any? This is my final comment here. This is a question. Do you have any comments on the idea? Why do progressives? See, I suspect progressives attack petite bourgeois landlords for class reasons, because they sort of fit a certain group, which is some reason why I'm much more sympathetic to sort of. Now, again, there's a lot of megacorps that are actually buying up land and so forth. But I would argue that in a lot of ways that certain landlords are in effect are doing the bidding of the state. So like if you want to have if you require solar panels on your roof, you might, or you want to have schools taxes for the school for a big relatively big size apartment building, someone needs to either collect the payments or evict the people who don't want to pay. So that's sort of the front line of the force here. And I think a lot of progressive commentators sort of want to wash their hands on that. And another thing I think that needs to be brought up here is more cultural reasons. I guess this won't be my final question. I think there's one more issue I think we just hit is a lot of, and Thomas Sowell is big on this. One of the reasons why people don't want to live in certain areas is they perceive it to be bad, or they perceive it to be crime, or they perceive the schools to be bad. Now, again, this is where the strong towns would say this is bias, and progressives would say it's bad. But this is where a lot of times progressives are sort of self-performative contradictions. For they'll either go to private schools, or they won't go to the schools there, or they won't even be anywhere near them. They'll sort of have hived off areas here. So in a sense, I'm sympathetic to the people who sort of want to move away to somewhere safe, or perceived to be safe here. And then cultural matters too. So this is sort of another area in which, one of the reasons people, they'll say high density is good. Okay, high density is good. If you can enforce the rules. So one of the reasons many people, I think, in the United States want to live in the suburbs is you're more, I shouldn't say this, but like we don't always lock our doors. Lots of people in the suburbs and are fairly, well, positioned here. And the rules in which the lockdowns were much more less severe. Now, again, the strong towns advocate, the guy, again, he's a moderate conservative, moderate free market here, narrowly defined. He says that, these people should want to retake over the city, so to speak, and stop trying to flee to the countryside. So I do think, there are sort of other factors to measure, like why people don't want to live in these certain areas and why people want to live in the others areas. I think the progressives miss it. I think it's sort of like the same way blaming the gas station owner for high gas prices. I think that's a lot of what the complaints about landlords ends up being, is complaining the gas station owner. Because okay, if the gas station owner gives it out for free, then he's just going to lose his gas station, so he has to collect the payments here. So you should have to attack the right people here. And I do think landlords at times are an easy target. Again, if there aren't exploitive landlords, there probably are. They probably are charging. They probably do, in some sense, benefit in some way. Although it's not entirely clear on these issues, which is a thing I say a lot on this show. So, any final comments with respect to, why do progressives attack landlords, social democrats and so forth? And do you agree with my analogy, sort of like blaming the gas station owner for the high gas prices? Swithin, that's my final comment.
To a large extent, yes. I mean, the landlord is in his position. He's got supply and demand. He's got lots of upkeep, lots of costs to run the place. I mean, you can't just charge zero price, because then you wouldn't provide the service to begin with. The reason why the landlord can sort of, quote unquote, exploit his position is, well, primarily for the fact of the supply restrictions we said before. I mean, if it was significantly easier to build your own or build elsewhere, then this wouldn't really be an issue in the same way. Of course, you get unscrupulous landlords who break contracts and stuff, or you could say to some extent unreasonable. But you wouldn't be able to do it in the way that they currently do it. Now, are landlords an easy target? Well, yes, they are, for multiple reasons. One, that everyone basically has a landlord of some description, or, I mean, even if you own your home, most people who own them don't actually own it outright. They have a mortgage on it, so then it's kind of like, it's the bank. And the bank's always a good people to criticize, and rightly so in many cases. But for renters, it's like, oh no, he's forcing, he's like, he's charging me to live, which is kind of like the same as like a farmer. But I can see the point that you're not directly working to provide the food. You're not directly working to provide the house in the way that you work to provide the food. At least you can perceive that way. And of course, there's lots of historical situations where land has been monopolized as well. I mean, the biggest landowners in England is the Church of England, the Queen, and the government. Lots of people go on about how the Queen and the Church of England would, but they don't really say the government owned lots of land. And of course, people, and I said enclosures and other stuff historically. So I do think they're an easy target. Density is an interesting point you raised. Yeah, if you're living on top of lots of people, people got to behave themselves, and if they don't, you're not going to want to be there. And also, I think just in general, people like the idea. Well, think about this. I mean, if you lived in like the medieval period, you'd have lots of green space around. You'd have your house, maybe in a village, or even a small town. I mean, people seem to like having green space to a large degree. And this is borne out by the type of houses that people demand. So I think whilst it's the strong townspeople are correct, but especially the suburbs as created in the US, which don't really think are the same as they are in the UK. They're not as sprawling. They're not as wide. I mean, so for instance, there was an art critic who's interesting, Andrew Graham Dixon, had some documentaries for the BBC. He was commenting about for Los Angeles, that he never really understood the city because it has no center. It's just sort of like a big sprawling mass. And then this artist who he was discussing made him understand, what made Los Angeles work the way it does. So all I'm saying is the pattern of development in America is quite a bit different from Europe, even though you could argue it's more sprawling now suburbia that is, than it is in the past. And the stronger people are correct that, subsidize roads, infrastructure and stuff. So they basically turn a little bit Kevin Carson-y. And I do think that's right. But if you're just taking for current choices that people have, the progressives are hilarious because they always sort of move into almost exclusively upper middle class white areas, whilst they can go on about how much they care about black people. And they sort of self-segregate into the whitest areas, basically because they want to move towards people who are more like them. But when white working class people do that, that's racism. But when then they do it, it's because we care about our children. Why would you want to live in the inner city these days if you can't live in a really nice area? So, I mean, for instance, if I wanted to live in London, the only way I would live in London if I lived in one of the most exclusive, expensive areas. Because the other places, stuff will get nicked, crime is high, I might get stabbed. So I'm not going to live in the East End of London. So a lot of these sort of the cities, as it is at present, given the choices you have, the people who live in inner cities are either extremely wealthy, young sort of upper middle class types who have no children but like all the bars and restaurant scene. And then, basically these days, minorities. You do get some white working class in England to a large extent, but I mean, they've kind of moved somewhere else to a large extent. But they do to some extent. You get immigrants of various types, blacks, Asians, etc. I think the same in the US, although mostly blacks there, probably of Hispanics. So on an individual basis, why would you even bother? Now, I suppose you could say, you should be the pioneering sort of white middle class type who left suburbia to try and reclaim the inner city.
Swithin, that does happen, and it's called gentrification, and people complain about it. Now, I'm fine with gentrification. Doesn't seem to, if people want to move back into the cities because the housing is cheap, great. But then when it gets done, it's also, so actually when they left, it's considered racism. When they move back in, it's considered racism. So in that sense, they can't win. Who's they? But they can't win in the sense that they'll be unhappy with either things. So those are my only comments to add there. Swithin?
Oh no! I agree. Gentrification does happen, but I think in general, although the situations which have been described as gentrification tend to be young upper middle class types from the impression I've got from it, rather than more regular types of people think, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? Now, I could be wrong, but you are right. If you do come into a failing area and you make it better, then it's gentrified and it feels more expensive. People have to leave. And it's like, well, Again, you can
Which sort of relates to my commenter in the strong towns where the people didn't want to improve the sidewalks because it raised the property taxes, which goes back to the point that the state is the sort of de facto overlord. In many of the state's decrees, progressives not only they're not even only neutral, they're actually outright supportive of it. Or even simple things like, some older houses get grandfathered in because they don't have elevators. Like my barber, for example, is on a second, in a house. But like if she'd opened it again, they would have to. She had to put a chairlift in here again. Now, okay, let's be nice to handicapped people. I'm not opposed to that, but it costs a few $1,000s to put a chairlift or an elevator in. And actually, one of the reasons why I was looking at the City Beautiful had about Soviet housing. One of the interesting things is they kept it at 5 stories because they didn't want to put elevators in. Because even them, they thought that, I don't know if that was their code or it was their or they just thought that people wouldn't like it, but they kept it at 5 stories because, well, any more than 5 flights is sort of a pain to walk. So there's lots of rules that go into like what type of houses you build, who can build them, where can you build them. Does the actual landlord have much control of it? In some cases, yes. Most cases, probably not. And there are sort of entrepreneurs like that Vice guy, that the mobile home park buyer up an entrepreneur. That's probably a dodgy business. I wouldn't get behind him. I'm not going to die on a hill to defend him. But then again, you have to look into why is he even in a position to do it, and so forth. And a lot of factors are just totally left out. So that'd be my concluding comment here with Swithin. I think we should probably wrap it up. Do you have any further comments, Swithin?
I'd entirely forgotten about the disabled stuff. Yeah, that's a huge thing since the 1990s. You have to have corridors of a certain width. You get ramps everywhere. It's really kind of expensive. I mean, on a purely utilitarian basis, the government should have said, oh, well, if you happen to buy a house and you're disabled, you got a wheelchair, like we've got a fund that you can modify it with. It's like, that would have been so much cheaper for them to do. But of course, they didn't do that. And interestingly, in America, at least, going to be decline, the large mega corporations supported the introduction of some things like what was in England the Disability Discrimination Act, whereas the small, medium-sized companies opposed it because it increased their costs significantly, whereas the mega corps probably thought, well, given we've got massive economies of scale, we've got a lift for this mega call center or office block. It's not that expensive per employee. Plus, of course, it makes all our small competitors go out of business because it's too expensive for them. Yes, I've entirely forgotten about that, and that's a very good point. I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact the show at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.